Starving German shepherd begs officer to share a meal. What he did next shocked everyone. The rain had turned the streets of Harbor District into a mirror of broken neon. Puddles quivered each time a gust of wind shoved its way down the alleyways, carrying the smell of salt from the bay and the faint tang of frying oil from the last restaurants still open past midnight. On the corner, beneath the glow of a flickering sign that read Harbor Lights, Officer Robert Hayes sat alone in a booth, his uniform jacket draped across the back of the seat, a half-finished plate of stew cooling in front of him. He wasn't hungry, not really. He had come here to avoid the silence of his apartment, to drown the echoes of old sirens in the clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of strangers. He pushed his spoon through the broth, half listening to the storm pressing against the windows, when a movement caught his eye. Outside, just beyond the glass fogged by steam, stood a dog. A German shepherd, ribs stark against his skin, fur matted from rain. His head was lifted not in aggression, but in quiet dignity. Amber eyes fixed on Robert as though the officer were the only person left in the world. Passers-by hurried past, umbrellas tilted, shoulders hunched, pretending not to see. Some spared a glance of irritation, others muttered about strays. But the dog never moved, never begged, never pawed at the door. He simply stood there in the downpour, a shadow carved by hunger, yet held upright by something deeper. Robert felt a tightness in his chest. He had seen those eyes before, eyes filled with both desperation and defiance, pulling survivors from wreckage during his years as a firefighter, staring back at him when hope was down to its last thread. Without thinking, he rose, lifted his plate from the table, and stepped out into the storm. The dog did not lunge at the food. He sat back on his haunches, water streaming from his coat, waiting, as though he sought not just a meal, but permission. Robert knelt, the rain soaking through his shirt, and lowered the plate. Only when their eyes met, man to animal, wounded soul to wounded soul, did the shepherd move forward. It was the beginning of everything. The storm pressed harder against the harbor that night, the wind rattling signs and tossing spray into the air like salt on an open wound. Robert crouched there on the pavement, jacket clinging wet to his shoulders, watching the dog eat. The shepherd's ribs showed beneath his soaked fur, each motion deliberate, not frantic. He chewed slowly, swallowing only after glancing up at Robert again as if to say, "I'm not just an animal scrambling for scraps. I know what it means to share." When the plate was empty, Robert reached out, tentative. The dog did not flinch. Instead, he lowered his head and pressed his wet muzzle gently into the officer's palm. Something inside Robert cracked open then, something he had held shut since the fire. Robert Hayes had once lived in blazes. As a firefighter in Portland, he'd built his identity around running into infernos others ran from. He had believed in the mathematics of courage, time, heat, oxygen. But one call had rewritten the equation. An old warehouse, flames hungry as beasts, his partner Jack's voice on the radio cut short by a roar no water could quell. Robert had lived, Jack had not. The weight of that imbalance had driven Robert out of the firehouse and into the quieter, steadier uniform of a police officer. Here, at least, the risks were measured differently. Or so he told himself on nights when he stared at the ceiling and heard the crackle of flames that weren't there. The German shepherd, ragged, rain-slick but proud, was a mirror of that survivor's guilt. Robert saw it in the way the dog held himself, scarred yet defiant, beaten but not broken. He coaxed the animal toward the patrol car, opening the back door and spreading his jacket across the seat. The shepherd hesitated, shook once as though shedding the night from his back, then leapt in, curling into the hollow of cloth and leather. Robert slid behind the wheel, the smell of wet fur filling the car oddly comforting. By the time they reached his apartment, the storm had tapered to drizzle. Robert carried the dog up 2 flights, every muscle reminding him of the weight, not heavy but real, of another life entrusted to him. Inside, he laid down a towel near the radiator, filled a bowl with water, and found half a loaf of bread to tear into small pieces. The shepherd ate, then circled twice before collapsing onto the towel with a sigh that sounded almost human. Robert sat on the couch, watching. The dog had not once barked, not once begged. Only those eyes spoke, amber, steady, aware. Robert felt the strange certainty that this was no stray accident, no random crossing of paths. Fate had chosen his table, his plate, his moment of weakness, and put this animal before him. At dawn, Robert made a call to Dr. Ellen Carter, the local vet who often helped the force with canine units. She scanned the dog for a microchip. The scanner beeped, and the display scrolled a name that froze Robert where he stood. Robert's throat went dry. He remembered the headlines: an explosion at an industrial plant on the outskirts of Portland, a K-9 team rushing in to locate hostages before the building collapsed. The dogs had been reported lost, honored posthumously, and yet here Argo stood, or rather lay on the clinic floor, thin, scarred, but alive. Robert stroked the rough fur between Argo's ears, feeling the raised lines of old wounds beneath his hand. The dog blinked slowly, leaning into the touch, as if he too remembered. For Robert, who had been trying to outrun ghosts for 3 years, it felt like standing in front of one and realizing it still breathed. That night, back at the apartment, Robert sat on the floor beside Argo's makeshift bed. He watched the dog dream, paws twitching as if chasing phantoms, chest heaving in rhythms that spoke of battles survived. Robert whispered into the dark, "You and me both, buddy. We weren't supposed to make it, but we did." The dog stirred, lifted his head, and rested it against Robert's knee. 2 survivors, bound not by chance but by scars, each recognizing the other in the silence. Morning found the harbor rinsed clean, gulls stitching white arcs across a pale sky. Robert brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching the city shake the rain from its shoulders. Behind him, the shepherd rose from the towel beside the radiator, stretched until each joint clicked lightly and padded over without hurry. He sat, poised and attentive, as if waiting to be assigned a place in this new room he had entered by accident and fate. "Argo," Robert said, testing the name aloud. The ears tipped forward. The dog's gaze was direct but not demanding, a professional checking in. Robert crouched, feeling the familiar pull in his shoulder that the old warehouse had left him, and offered his hand open and still. Argo nosed it, then placed his chin briefly in Robert's palm. Contact granted, not claimed. They began with practicalities: water, food measured in slow increments to spare a starved stomach, the quiet ritual of brushing out the rain-matted fur. Under the comb, scars surfaced like faint coastlines, old burns, healed punctures, the pale seam of a long stitch along the flank. Argo accepted the grooming with the immobility of a trained dog, tail thudding once against the floor when Robert found a patch at the base of his neck that made his eyes close in private bliss. Robert spoke more to fill the room than to expect comprehension. "House rules are light," he said, half smiling. "Couch is a gray area. Kitchen is mine. Windows are for both of us." Argo glanced at the couch and then chose the floor beside it, laying his head over his paws as if to declare that shared space didn't require claiming. At mid-morning, Robert clipped a spare lead to the dog's collar and took him down the stairs, testing pace and distance. Argo matched him step for step without tugging, keeping to the left, eyes scanning the corridor corners, the landing, the street beyond, as if cataloging exits. On the sidewalk, the dog paused to let a stroller pass, body angled to shelter rather than block, an unconscious geometry that made Robert's chest tighten. Training like that didn't vanish, it waited. They walked to a small park carved between warehouses where the grass held last night's rain. Robert tried a few neutral commands: sit, down, heel, avoiding voice inflections that might echo anything buried in the dog's muscle memory. Argo responded with crisp precision, but it wasn't mechanical. He looked to Robert after each task, seeking affirmation, not just release. When a car backfired on the street, Argo startled, pivoted toward the sound, then checked himself and returned to heel on his own. Robert knelt and pressed a hand to the warm ribcage, feeling the quick thrum settle. "I'm here," he said into the fur. "We're here." Back home, he left the bedroom door open. Argo nosed along the threshold, sniffed the dresser, the open closet where a dress shirt still hung from a life that had expected more weekends than grief offered, and came to rest at a framed photograph on the nightstand. Jack's grin, broad and irreverent, leaned against a ladder truck gleaming with new paint. The dog didn't paw or lick the frame. He lowered himself to the floor and set his body against the nightstand's leg, anchoring the furniture with the same quiet gravity he had used to steady a frightened child in some other life. Robert sat on the edge of the bed and let the memory come, not as a wave to drown him, but as a tide that receded and returned with less sting. In the afternoon, Robert stopped by the precinct for paperwork he'd left unfinished. He debated leaving Argo at the apartment, then decided against it. The dog rode in the back calmly, head turned toward the cracked window. At the station, officers looked up, the way people do when a story enters the room before its words. "Stray?" someone asked. Robert shook his head. "Not exactly." Sergeant Pike, who had trained 2 K-9 teams during his career and retired their photos on the wall like family portraits, studied the dog for a long moment. "He's handled," Pike said at last, the simple verdict of a veteran. He knelt, presented his hand, and waited. Argo accepted the greeting with sober politeness. "You run his chip?" Robert nodded. "Name's Argo." The sergeant's brows lifted. "That Argo?" The silence that followed didn't need explanation. Legends had a way of traveling, even when the facts didn't. On the way out, Argo paused beside the bulletin board near the door, nose lifting slightly. The faintest hiss came from the hallway. Someone down the corridor had left a janitor's closet ajar, the ammonia tang sharp. Argo looked up at Robert, then back toward the sound, as if reporting. Robert laughed softly. "Message received. We'll take the stairs." That evening, the sky cleared to a flat blue. Robert brought out a rubber ball he'd found at the bottom of a drawer and rolled it lightly across the floor. Argo watched it bump the baseboard and return on a lazy arc, then placed a paw on it, pinning it without chase. A game wasn't the point. He nudged the ball back with his nose, slow, deliberate, inviting interaction, not adrenaline. Robert rolled it again, a little faster. Argo stopped it and left it there, eyes on Robert's face. "Your move," the look said. The play between them was a conversation written in small decisions, each a test of trust, each returned with care. Before sleep, Robert set a hand on the dog's chest. The rhythm there was steady now, the breaths deeper. Across the room, the window hummed with the last traffic on the avenue. "You found me as much as I found you," Robert said, the words quiet enough that they felt like a promise spoken into the weave of the night. Argo flicked an ear, then pushed his head into Robert's palm, sealing the vow with weight. Two survivors, their first day shared not in spectacle, but in 100 ordinary choices that add up to belonging. It wasn't dramatic, it was better. It was the kind of connection that could hold when the next hard thing arrived. And in Robert's gut, in the dog's watchful stillness, both of them seemed to know it would. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, yet beneath the quiet cadence of feeding times and short walks lay the weight of two histories neither Robert nor Argo could easily set aside. It was Carolyn, the precinct's part-time counselor, who sometimes stopped by to check on officers after rough shifts, who first suggested Robert write down the story of how he'd found the dog. "Sometimes putting things in order helps you see what's missing," she said. Robert didn't argue. He opened a notebook one night, stared at the first blank page, and instead of writing about the rain-soaked meeting outside Harbor Lights, his pen carried him back 3 years. The warehouse fire had been Portland's worst in decades. A tangle of chemicals and propane tanks hidden inside the walls turned what should have been a routine response into a detonating furnace. Robert and Jack had been on the second floor when the beam gave way. He still remembered the scream of metal, the thunderous crack, and the sudden absence where his partner's body had been. Robert had scrambled free with burns along his arm, but Jack was buried before anyone could reach him. For weeks afterward, Robert woke at the sound of imagined sirens, his throat clogged with the acrid ghost of smoke. Survivors called it guilt. He called it debt. It had driven him out of the fire service and into the steadier procedural life of a police officer, but the embers never went out. Argo's past emerged in fragments too, though not from Robert's pen. The microchip had told the official version, deceased, line of duty. But scars and instinct told a different tale. Dr. Carter, the veterinarian, pieced together what his body revealed. A deep burn along the rib cage, healed but twisted. Old fractures in the hind leg, likely from falling debris. His teeth worn in a way that suggested years of controlled work, biting sleeves and equipment, not the reckless gnawing of strays. He had been trained for service, survived the blast, and somehow slipped through the cracks, declared dead, abandoned to recover alone. One evening, while Robert sorted through old case files at his kitchen table, Argo lay at his feet and stirred suddenly, paws jerking in dream. He whined, the sound low and urgent, and his body trembled. Robert bent down, murmuring reassurance. The dog jolted awake, panting, eyes wide as though still inside smoke. Robert recognized the look. He had seen it in the mirror after the warehouse fire. He rested his forehead against Argo's and whispered, I know what it's like to come back when you shouldn't have." The dog's breathing slowed, syncing with his own. Two survivors, each haunted by a night the world thought had ended them. The tragedies they carried did more than bind them. They reshaped the air between them. On patrol, Argo was alert, scanning alleys and doorways, but when they passed the blackened husk of an old cannery, his ears pinned flat, his body lowering as if expecting the roof to fall again. Robert tightened the leash gently, guiding him past, feeling the echo of his own chest constrict. They were both relics of disasters that still smoldered unseen. At the precinct, Sergeant Pike found Robert one afternoon staring too long at the training wall where photos of retired K-9s hung. "Don't let the past keep you from giving him a present," Pike said. He tapped the glass over a picture of a shepherd long gone. "These dogs don't dwell, they endure. Learn from that." Robert nodded, though he knew endurance could look an awful lot like denial. The weight of the past grew heavier when Robert visited Jack's widow, Emily, to return a book Jack had lent him years before. She opened the door, surprise flickering into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Argo stood quietly at Robert's side, tail still, gaze steady. Emily knelt to greet him, and something in her softened when the dog pressed his head into her hand. "You remind me of him," she murmured, glancing at Robert. "Still carrying ghosts? You don't have to." He wanted to tell her that some debts can't be cleared, only carried. Instead, he watched Argo lean into her touch and thought maybe ghosts weren't meant to be carried alone. That night, Robert dreamed of the warehouse again. Only this time, when the beam gave way, a dark shape lunged through the smoke. Not Jack, not him, but Argo, dragging him clear. He woke with tears on his face and the dog beside the bed, watching as if he'd heard the dream. Their tragedies had left marks no one else could see, but together they began to make those marks bearable. Each scar, each memory of fire and collapse, each night of hunger and survival was no longer an isolated burden. They were shared now, folded into a quiet pact neither had spoken, but both lived by. We came back when we shouldn't have. That means we were meant to. The bond forged in grief was strong, but grief alone could not dictate the future. Something else was waiting, a test neither of them could predict, one that would force scars into action and turn survival into choice. The first sign came on a Tuesday night, just past midnight, when the city seemed lulled into sleep. Robert had been finishing paperwork at his desk. Argo sprawled at his feet when the dog jolted upright. His ears pricked, his body stiffened, and a low growl rose in his throat. Robert paused, listening. At first, there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the rain whispering against the glass. Then, faint but distinct, the sound of a child crying. Argo moved to the door before Robert could stand. His body language was absolute. "Follow me." Robert trusted that instinct more than he trusted most men on the force. He grabbed his coat, holstered his sidearm, and let the dog lead. They hurried down slick streets, Argo pulling with the urgency of a hound, chasing a scent he could not afford to lose. The trail wound through alleys until it ended at a warehouse on the edge of the harbor, long abandoned since its owner fled a bankruptcy scandal years ago. The cry came again, thin, muffled. Robert's gut clenched. He should radio for backup, secure the perimeter, wait. But the memory of Jack's death burned through procedure, and the sound of a child in distress burned through doubt. He signaled Argo to heel, drew his flashlight, and slipped through a side door hanging by a rusted hinge. Inside, shadows crowded between rotting crates. The smell of mildew mixed with something sourer. Fear, sweat, the stale stench of unwashed fabric. Argo froze, nose working, then tugged sharply left. In a corner, bound with rope, lay a little girl no older than 8. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, her lips cracked from thirst. She whimpered when Robert knelt, then stilled as Argo pressed his head gently against her shoulder, offering the kind of reassurance only a dog could give. Robert cut the ropes quickly, murmuring soft words, but the victory lasted only seconds. From the dark, movement erupted. 2 men lunged, knives glinting. One slashed toward Robert's arm, pain flaring as the blade grazed flesh. The other reached for the girl. Before Robert could react, Argo launched, his body a blur of muscle and teeth. He clamped down on the attacker's wrist, dragging him back with a snarl that shook the rafters. The man screamed, the knife clattering across the floor. The fight was chaos. Robert grappled with the second assailant, the child pressed against his back, while Argo held the first pinned, refusing to let go, even as fists rained down on his ribs. Another figure appeared from the shadows. Reinforcements. Robert's breath caught. They were outnumbered. For a moment, the warehouse became that burning ruin again. Collapsing beams. Too many enemies. Not enough time. But Argo did not yield. Blood streaked his flank where a boot had connected, yet he shifted his weight, dragging his attacker into the path of the newcomer, sending both stumbling. Robert seized the chance, tackling the second man, slamming his wrist against the concrete until the knife dropped. He shouted into his radio for backup, words sharp and urgent, then turned to see Argo still fighting, jaws locked, eyes blazing with the fury of survival. The child screamed as another man burst from the far side of the room. Robert's heart seized. There were more of them. This wasn't a random crime. This was organized, calculated. He drew his sidearm, firing a warning shot into the rafters. The echo cracked like thunder, scattering birds from the beams. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The men hesitated, gauging their odds. One spat, yanking free of Argo's grip, clutching his ruined wrist. "This isn't over," he hissed, retreating into the dark. The others followed, vanishing before the sirens arrived. Robert slumped to the floor, chest heaving, blood warm on his sleeve. Argo staggered back, sides heaving, one ear torn and bleeding, but he stood guard until the first officers burst in, weapons raised. Only then did he collapse beside Robert, pressing his weight against the officer's leg as though to say, "We made it through." The little girl clung to Robert's shoulder, sobbing into his uniform. "You're safe now," he whispered, though his voice broke. "We've got you. He's got you." He stroked Argo's neck, feeling the dog's pulse racing beneath scarred skin, and knew this night was only the beginning. Because the truth had slipped into the open with those fleeing men. This wasn't just an abduction. It was part of something larger, darker, a network that had thrived in silence, hidden in the city's forgotten corners. And now, Robert and Argo had stepped into its path. The precinct buzzed for days after the raid. The rescued girl was safe in hospital care, her parents sobbing gratitude that words could not contain. But the files recovered from the warehouse painted a picture far more sinister than a single abduction. Names, dates, coded ledgers, evidence of a trafficking ring that had been operating for years. It was a network that thrived in secrecy, hiding its crimes in forgotten corners of the city. And now, by sheer chance and the instincts of a half-starved German shepherd, its veil had begun to tear. Robert found little comfort in the small victory. His arm was stitched, his shoulder bruised, but it was Argo who bore the worst of it. Bandages swathed the dog's flank, his movements stiff. Yet every time Robert left the room, Argo tried to follow, tail thumping against the floor in stubborn insistence. He had been trained never to abandon his handler, and pain did not rewrite that rule. Robert knelt by him often, stroking the fur around the scars, whispering the words he had once wished someone would tell him. You don't have to keep fighting alone. When the task force planned a follow-up raid on a second location, Robert argued to be included. Pike hesitated but relented, understanding that Argo's nose had proven more reliable than any map. The warehouse this time was larger, a decaying shipyard shed by the bay. Officers surrounded the structure under cover of night, the wind carrying the tang of salt and oil. Robert crouched low, Argo at his side, both breathing in rhythm. The signal came. They advanced. The inside erupted in chaos. Shouts, the clash of boots, the metallic shriek of doors forced open. Children huddled in corners, thin arms shielding eyes from flashlights. Traffickers bolted into the dark, some captured, others vanishing like smoke. Robert spotted one of the men from the first raid, scarred wrist cradled against his chest, and gave chase. Argo lunged with him, the two moving as a single force. The fight was brutal. A blade flashed in the gloom, catching Robert's side, spinning him against a crate. The man loomed, raising the knife again. Argo launched with a roar, jaws locking on the attacker's arm, dragging him down. But another man appeared from behind, swinging a metal pipe that struck Argo's ribs with a sickening crack. The shepherd yelped, but did not release his grip. Blood slicked the floor beneath them. Robert surged forward, tackling the second man, rage burning hotter than pain. The knife clattered away. Officers swarmed in, voices loud, commands barked. But in the center of it all was Argo, still locked on the first attacker, body trembling with effort, refusing to yield until Robert's hand pressed to his shoulder. "It's over," Robert gasped. "You've done enough. Let go." For a moment, the dog resisted, eyes blazing with the memory of every fight he had survived. Then, slowly, he released, staggering back into Robert's arms. His chest heaved, blood staining his bandages, but his gaze stayed fixed on Robert as if to ask, "Did we save them?" "Yes," Robert whispered, choking on the word. Around them, children were led into waiting arms, officers cuffed the men who had profited from their suffering, and the night rang with sirens and sobs. The city's shadows had been forced into light. Argo collapsed then, exhausted, his head heavy against Robert's chest. Robert held him, rocking slightly as if the motion could keep him tethered. Tears blurred his vision. He remembered Jack's last night, the fire, the weight of failure. But this time, someone had come back with him. Not a partner in uniform, but a survivor, with fur and scars and loyalty fiercer than any oath. When the paramedics lifted Argo onto a stretcher, Robert followed close, one hand on the dog's side. He whispered through clenched teeth, a vow forged in the smoke and the blood. "You're not dying in the dark. Not you, not tonight." The hospital smelled of antiseptic and faint coffee, its corridors humming with the weary shuffle of night staff. Robert paced the length of the waiting room, hands clenched, listening for news. Hours stretched like days. Then at last, Dr. Carter emerged, her scrubs flecked with tiredness, but her eyes steady. "He's going to make it," she said. "It was close, but he's stronger than he looks." Relief hit Robert so hard he had to sit. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to weep without shame. When he was finally permitted into recovery, Argo lay on a padded mat, chest wrapped in clean bandages, an IV snaking gently into his leg. The dog lifted his head the moment Robert entered, tail tapping once, twice. Robert dropped to his knees beside him, pressing his forehead to the shepherd's. "You did it," he whispered. "You brought them home. You brought me home." News spread quickly. The papers called Argo the dog who rose from the dead. Images of the raid filled television screens, but what captured hearts was the photograph of a battered German shepherd resting his head in a police officer's lap. Both of them exhausted, both of them alive. Donations poured in for the rescued children. Letters of thanks arrived for Robert and his partner with 4 paws. Weeks later, the city held a ceremony on the courthouse steps. Officers stood in dress blues, children sat on their parents' shoulders, and the mayor presented Argo with a medal engraved simply, "Valor." The crowd erupted when Robert clipped it to the dog's collar, Argo standing tall, scars visible yet worn like badges. But the true reward came later, in the quiet of Robert's apartment. The couch was no longer off limits. Sophie, the girl from the warehouse, visited often, her laughter threading through rooms that had once known only silence. Argo sprawled across the rug, one eye always half open, as if still guarding them all. Robert would catch himself smiling at nothing in particular, realizing that the weight he had carried since the warehouse fire was lighter now, not gone, but shared. One evening, as twilight painted the harbor gold, Robert clipped on Argo's leash and led him outside. They walked to the water's edge, the city behind them, the horizon wide and open. Robert looked down at the shepherd, whose amber eyes mirrored his own resilience. "We got another chance," he said softly. "Let's use it right." Argo pressed against his leg, silent, loyal, unyielding. Together, they faced the coming night, not as 2 survivors haunted by tragedy, but as a family reborn from it. Because not all heroes wear uniforms. Some walk on 4 legs, leaving paw prints across broken ground, and in doing so, teach men how to live again.